My name is Trisha Tang, and I would like to welcome you to the Own Your Health Community Forum that's sponsored by St. Paul's Hospital. Today's presentation is Diabetes, Prevention, Treatment, and Possibly Cure. Tonight, we are very pleased to have Dr. Ehud Ur present. Dr. Ur is Professor of Medicine at UBC. He's the director of the Diabetes Center at St. Paul's Hospital, the head of UBC, PHC, VGH divisions of endocrinology, and most importantly, he's my boss. He is a graduate of the University of London and trained in medicine and endocrinology at the St. Bartholomew's Hospital in London. Dr. Ur came to Canada in 1992 and was assistant professor of medicine at Memorial University in St. John's, Newfoundland, until May 1997. He is a board director of the CDA, which is the Canadian Diabetes Association, and the chair of Clinical and Scientific Section. He is also on the board of directors of the organization Obesity Canada. Dr. Ur's research interests include neuroendocrine disorders, diabetes, dyslipidemia, and obesity. He is actively engaged in both laboratory and clinical research and has published over 150 papers, chapters, and abstracts in these fields. Dr. Ur has been an investigator on clinical trials of new agents in diabetes, lipid disorders, and obesity. His laboratory is currently studying the activity of the fat-regulating hormones leptin and resistin in the brain and the pituitary. Please give a warm welcome to Dr. Ur.
So, first of all, thank you very much for that very kind introduction. I know that even if I wasn't your boss, you'd be nice to me, wouldn't you? Secondly, a warm welcome to all of you here. I know that some of these lectures have been on a variety of different conditions, this is probably the one that touches the most people in our population, because diabetes is a common condition. How many here, if you don't mind my asking, how many people here actually have diabetes? Just put up your hand. Okay, so about half the audience. How many people here feel that they're at risk of diabetes and therefore have come here because they want to learn about that? Oh, that's another the audience. How many people here have, so if you're not in those first two groups, how many people here of who's left have a relative, a close relative or a friend with diabetes and want to learn about it for that? Yeah. So that pretty much summarizes the audience, those three categories. How many people here don't want to know about diabetes, just in the wrong room? Okay. Right, so everybody has a vested interest, and the reality is, even if you didn't think you had a vested interest when you came here, you should know that you do, because diabetes will affect either you or somebody close to you. It's such an increasingly common condition. And these are the covers of two magazines that you see in the newsstand in the days when we used to have newsstands and magazines. Actually, just I guess about 5-6 years ago, no, 2003, I picked those up, nearly 10 years ago. And they were highlighting, funnily enough, in the same week, essentially the same story, and that is this growing worldwide epidemic of diabetes. The first cover on The Economist there really talks about the increasing prevalence of obesity and weight problems in our populations, and suggests that human evolution is progressing in a somewhat unwanted direction, that people are getting bigger and bigger, and that this is just a function of the modern day. And on the right-hand side, more specifically about diabetes, there's a photograph there of a little girl with diabetes. First of all, there's nothing unusual about little girls having diabetes, but until about 10 or 15 years ago, typically a little girl with diabetes would have type 1 diabetes. This little girl actually has type 2 diabetes, and you can see she is a little bit chubby. She's on the bigger side, and this increasing prevalence of obesity and weight problems in younger people has resulted in an explosion of the so-called type 2 diabetes in younger people, such that we no longer talk about adult onset and childhood onset diabetes. Some of you may be familiar with a variety of different terms, insulin dependent and non-insulin dependent, and adult onset and childhood onset, or juvenile diabetes. There are all these terms that have been floating around over the years, which basically we've thrown out. We only have two types of diabetes now. Well, essentially two main types, type 1 and type 2. Type 1 is the kind that affects typically children, although you can get it as an adult as well. And that kind is somewhat catastrophic in that from one day almost to the next, you go from having perfectly normal insulin and glucose to having none at all. Over the course of a very, very short period of time, often weeks or days. And these are the people who have to have insulin immediately. And if they don't have insulin immediately, they die. This was a disease that essentially was, quote, cured by Banting and Best in the 1920s when they discovered insulin and made it available to young children who developed this very catastrophic problem, which in the past meant inevitable death. It was diabetes, type 1 diabetes in those days, before 1920, before the discovery of insulin, essentially meant death within weeks. And typically, as I said, they would be children, and it was very sad. You would just watch your child waste away, and there was nothing that could be done. Now, of course, from 1920 onwards, we've had insulin, and insulin has dramatically altered that disease, but it hasn't eliminated all the problems that are associated with diabetes, and we'll talk about that. Type 2 is a very different disease. I suspect that most people who are here who have diabetes have type 2. And type 2, as I said, used to be called adult onset. We don't call it adult onset anymore because, as you see, it happens in children. And that's a disease that's much slower and progressive over time. And is associated not with a total absence of insulin, but with resistance to insulin, and ultimately a progressive decline in the ability of the pancreas to make insulin. We'll be talking in more detail about that as we go through the slides. Now, you know, the data suggests that there is really an explosion in diabetes in the world population. And what's interesting is, let me ask you, where do you think the biggest increase in diabetes is taking place in the world right now? Somebody want to throw out a place? Maybe a continent or a country? India. I hear India. I hear India from an expert, but she's wrong. What? North America is actually where we're seeing the least increase. You're going to be shocked.
China.
China is definitely on the increase, but it's not where the biggest increase is taking place.
France.
Where?
France.
France? All that rich food that they eat? No, not at all. Definitely a huge increase in First Nations in that population, but that's not where the biggest increase is taking place. You're going to be shocked. What's that? Vancouver. No, you got to think further afield. Africa. Thank you. Now, we're used to seeing pictures of people starving in Africa. We don't think of people in Africa having an increase in obesity or an increase in diabetes. But actually, Africa and the Middle East are the two parts of the world in which we are seeing the biggest increase in diabetes. And in fact, we are seeing an overall, and all this is related to weight excess, we're seeing an overall increase in the world population of weight problems, overweight and obesity throughout the planet. It's a global problem. You know, we still have this mentality that there are people starving in the world, and it's true, there are. There are still people who are subjected to famine. But in fact, in the year 2003, the number of 2007, the number of overweight and obese people overtook the number of underweight people on the planet. So there are actually now something like 0.7 billion people that are underweight. That's still a lot of people, of course. But there are 1.3 billion, which is actually the population of China, if you like, 1.3 billion humans of a total of about 6 point something that are actually overweight or obese. So it's a huge problem, and the populations that are being most affected in terms of diabetes are the ones that have had the least amount of diabetes in the past. So in fact, the ones that have had quite a bit of diabetes, like us, North America in general, Europe, France, so on. Those are the ones where the increase is actually not that marked, and the dramatic increase in diabetes is actually taking place in the so-called developing world. In fact, my little phrase is the definition of a developing country is that they're developing diabetes. Certainly sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East are where we're seeing an explosion in this problem. In Canada, the obesity trend is really quite interesting. We are seeing more and more increase in weight in Canada. This is actually a slide showing how it's changed from 1985, where right across the nation, no province had more than 10% of its population overweight. Obese. So it's a uniform picture across the country in 1985, which is, what is that? It's only 25 years ago. And now, 2006, so that's 20 years later, you can see that the vast majority of the country running rates between 15 and 20%. British Columbia, yay, we're actually thinner than the rest of the population, except for Quebec. Quebecers have a lower weight, but that's because they smoke more, and that cigarette smoking keeps your weight down. And the ones who actually suffer the most problems with obesity are actually the Maritimers and the Newfoundlanders, and also up in the north, where we see, as somebody suggested, very high rates of weight problems amongst First Nations. And this is all the single most important factor that underlies the epidemic of type 2 diabetes. Now, let's be clear about one thing. You don't have to be massively overweight to develop diabetes, okay? Sure, this is telling you about the increased weight in the population, the increased rate of obesity. But in fact, as a high tide raises many boats, essentially the problem is that people are predisposed to diabetes based on their genetics, okay? So you inherit a genetic predisposition to diabetes, and that is brought out by being overweight, even a little bit overweight. The conundrum is, the challenge is that what leads to your diabetes is a mixture of the two factors, so your genetic predisposition and your weight. So simply put, most people are somewhere in the middle in that they have some genetic predisposition. That means that they have a history in their family. That means they've inherited genes that make them prone to diabetes, and they're a little bit overweight. At the extreme end, you have people that have virtually no genetic predisposition. They're just extremely overweight, and that's the single most important factor that they have. And at the other end of the scale, and there may be people here who represent this, where they're not overweight at all. In fact, they may actually be quite thin, but they have a very strong genetic predisposition to diabetes. And that means that they have usually both parents and maybe even 4 grandparents who all had diabetes. And so that's what we call genetic loading, like loading the dice. The more people you have in your family who have diabetes, the more genetically predisposed you are to getting it. Now, it's, as I said, there isn't a hard and fast rule, but generally those are the factors. This is a patient of mine who was overweight from childhood and developed high blood pressure at the age of 15, which is a common complication of being overweight, and became diabetic at the age of 17, which is extremely young to develop type 2 diabetes. He was put on medication, and I actually first met him when I started him on insulin at the age of 25. And he had a heart attack at the age of 30. This is not a happy story, I'm afraid, because he died. He died from that heart attack. The reason why I'm telling you this rather sad story is because it illustrates a number of very important points. The first is that diabetes leads to heart disease. It's the most important complication of diabetes. 80% of the complications of diabetes in terms of the mortality and the healthcare costs are related to heart disease. Many people don't understand that connection. They tell you, oh, I have heart disease. I don't know why I have it. I've had diabetes for 20 years. And they don't seem to make that connection between the two. And this is a very good illustration of how dramatically connected they are. And secondly, the fact that diabetes, when it begins at a young age, can lead to early complications and, sadly in this case, an early demise. As I said, he died at the really a very, very young age of 30 from a disease that typically in the past would have affected people much older. And this is really what I want to stress, the connection between obesity and weight problems, the so-called metabolic syndrome, which is a number of changes that take place in the blood and the biochemistry, secondary to having a little bit too much weight, and ultimately type 2 diabetes, all of which results in potentially what we call coronary heart disease or a heart attack, which can be a rather fatal problem that can develop. So I just want to spend a few minutes talking about why, because this really kind of sets the scene for explaining how we can prevent diabetes and how, once we have diabetes, how we can prevent it from progressing. I really want to talk about why we've suddenly developed this increased, this huge epidemic of diabetes and obesity. And it all has to do with our genes and how we function in our environment. Now, this is something that is quite interesting, but is complicated, so I want you to bear with me as I explain this. You have to understand that genetically, we're no different than we were 10,000 years ago, 20,000 years ago, 30,000 years. There's been no change in humans genetically over that period of time. We're identical to prehistoric man. If you took the DNA of a prehistoric man and reconstituted it today, if you could, you know, I don't know if you saw Jurassic Park where they did that with dinosaurs, but that concept, if you could do it, you would have somebody who would be identical to us today, be no different in terms of how they function, physiology, the way their brain works, everything would be identical. All right, so we haven't changed. I mean, our world has changed very dramatically, but we, as physiologically functioning organisms, have not changed in 30, 40, 50, maybe even 100,000 years. And so what you have to understand is that the environment that we evolved to live in was the one that pertained 20, 30, 40, 50,000 years ago. A very, very different environment from the one that we have today. There's a huge mismatch between our genes and our physiology and the world that we live in. The world that we were designed for is the one on the left there with that prehistoric man, where we were hunters and gatherers. And when we say hunters and gatherers, what do we mean? Well, we foraged around, we killed the odd animal, but typically we didn't eat meat every day. We foraged mainly for nuts and berries. We ate a lot of fruit, some vegetables, but mainly nuts and berries, and the odd kill in terms of hunting for animals, wild animals. The other component of our lives 30,000 years ago, 40,000 years ago, is that we were incredibly physically active, okay? What would happen to you if you weren't physically active? You'd die. Why? Because you'd be chased by some predator who would eat you. Or if you weren't physically active, you wouldn't be able to survive because you wouldn't get food. You needed to be physically active in order to get food. So that's the environment that we were designed for. That's what our genetic plan is for. Whether you believe in evolution or God, either way, that is the world that we were created for. Fast forward to today, and we have a very different world. A world in which we have, first of all, a dramatically different diet from the one that we were designed to eat. So what are the kinds of things that we eat now that we really didn't eat in the past? Well, first of all, sugar. There was no sugar. Sugar is a refined product of cane. We had no sugar in our diet. We had complex sugars. We had carbohydrates that were complex, but we didn't have any of the kind that are processed. You know, the starches that we have in bread and pasta and all those wonderful things. Secondly, we didn't have any processed foods. Okay, everything was natural in that world. Thirdly, we had much more dietary fibers. Now we have very little in the way of dietary fiber unless you add it specifically. And then finally, salt. Huge amount of salt. that we eat, that we just take to be natural. But in fact, salt was a very small part of the diet in the past because there was not access to huge amounts of salt. In fact, do you know where the word salary comes from? Salary? You get your salary? Get paid your salary? Do you know where that comes from? Anybody know? Salt. And who was paid with salt? The Roman legions. Okay? So the Romans, in the days of the Roman Empire, they used to pay their soldiers with salt. That was their pay. It was a commodity that had value, and people traded in it. And that's where the term salary comes from. The word comes from the Latin word for salt, sol. Nowadays, of course, nobody would be paid in salt. It's such a cheap thing, and we liberally throw it all over our food. So these are examples of foods, not saying good or bad. I'm just saying it's different from what we were designed to eat. And so that has consequences, and clearly, as we've seen in the last 20 or 30 years, those consequences are significant. But there's one further factor that's far bigger than all the others in terms of the change. And you can see that in the slide. Somebody want to throw out what it is? Lifestyle. Well, this is all lifestyle, I think. Physical activity. So you're all sitting there comfortably in your chairs. And the reality is that our physical activity as compared to our ancestors is somewhere around 1 or 2 or 3% on a daily basis. It's dramatically less. Dramatically less. And it's interesting. It's a bizarre human trait that we are an incredibly inventive species. We're a very inventive species. But our inventiveness is all about one thing. What is our inventiveness about? Well, not leisure, but labor saving. We want to save labor. We want to be able to do... We are a species that creates tools. And it started, here with the caveman and his axe and his bow and arrow. Those are the original tools, and then the wheel, and then you progress through history. And then in the last 20 or 30 years, actually since the Second World War, there's been this explosion of inventiveness around the motor car and various electrical tools that we've developed, such that we have virtually no physical activity left to do to live. Okay? We don't have daily energy requirements to live. And we had to create a false kind of physical activity in order to maintain our health, and we call it exercise. A prehistoric man would have laughed at this notion that you actually go off and go for a run or without actually chasing an animal or being chased by an animal. Why would you do that? So this is essentially the single most important and most dramatic difference that has occurred in the last 30 or 40 years. This dramatic reduction in physical activity that is not the activity of sports and leisure that I'm talking about. That's sort of increased a little bit. But the activities of daily living. If you think about our grandparents or parents and how, for example, they would have to, goodness me, they'd have to wash their dishes by hand. They'd have to wash their clothes by hand. All these kind of things that we take for granted now, it's very, I know that there are many people that still don't have dishwashers in their houses, but the majority of people do. The various labor-saving devices that we have in our homes, the cars and the buses that transport us from one place to another, that mean that we don't have to be that physically active in our daily lives. And this has taken its toll. And so what happens is we have a physiology and a genotype that's designed for a specific environment that just doesn't exist anymore. And we're maladapted. We have a mismatch between the world that we live in and our genes. And so there's only two things we can do about that, bottom line. We can either change our genes, and that doesn't happen overnight. That requires evolution, or medical science, which perhaps in the next 20 or 30 years will result in genetic engineering that results in our adjusting our genes so that we're better suited for the environment that we've built around us, or we can look at our lifestyle and try and modify it, and the goal is to try and make it look, to try and keep it clean, but as much like prehistory as we can, which is bizarre, but that's actually what I advocate, that we actually try and be on a diet that's as close to the prehistoric diet that humans were designed to eat, and certainly that we try and increase our physical activity levels in order to be as active as we can. So here's an interesting example. This is a family from South Carolina, I think. Do you know what this is? Dinner. Hopefully not. This is all the food that they eat in 1 week. Okay, that's all the food that they eat in 1 week, and you can see how bad this diet is. I mean, first of all, you can see there's a lot of processed food. There's a lot of pop drinks. There's a lot of meat, and I think there's some fruit somewhere in there. Some grapes right in the middle. Maybe I don't know, that's celery or lettuce there with it. Some tomatoes as well. But in general, you can see that most of this stuff is as far from being natural as you can imagine. And at the other extreme, this is another family. They're from South Sudan in a refugee camp, and this is what they eat in a week. All right? What I'm telling you here is the extremes of what humans are able to tolerate, but also the fact that this can actually support life, although you would be surprised that they are able to stay alive on that. And the consequences of the exposure to the excess calories and the excess bad calories, the excess bad food, is what leads to disease. Now, this family actually looks like the picture of health. They actually don't look particularly overweight, and they don't have diabetes. And that is another important point. So this lifestyle doesn't guarantee ill health. It doesn't guarantee ill health, and it's not immoral. Okay, people get very moralistic about food and lifestyle and all this stuff. It's completely irrelevant. There's nothing moral or immoral about these lifestyles. What we do know is that if you have a genetic predisposition for diabetes and for weight problems, that this kind of lifestyle is going to be more likely to lead to those problems. And that's really all these slides are trying to say. Here is the problem of human inventiveness. The problem of human inventiveness that I told you about, whereby we create new ways of saving energy. And this guy solved the problem of walking the dog. By having the dog on the treadmill, he can sit and watch the hockey game and have a beer without actually having to be physically active. But this is not atypical. This is human nature. We are designed in order to save calories. We're designed to be as clever as we can in coming up with ways of saving calories. The tragedy is that we don't need to save these calories anymore. We're still inventing these things and we're still buying them, but we don't need them. We kind of have this huge increase in leisure activity, leisure time that we have to fill because we're no longer doing these chores anymore, and it all seems a bit of a kind of circular, pointless thing. This is from another part of Canada, as you can imagine, with the snow there. This is a slide that I took to illustrate a very common problem. Common phenomenon, and that is when you go to a car park, you'll see the same thing. All the cars are parked as near as possible to the entrance of the shop, the Walmart or supermarket, whatever it is. Everybody will park as near as possible to those doors. Okay, and why do we do that? That's human nature, because we want to minimize our physical activities. We go into the supermarket, we don't have to want to carry heavy bags all the way back to the car. The cars that are in the far end of the car park are all cars that have been joyridden and abandoned. They're not cars of people that actually are going to the store. But in fact, this photograph was not taken at any kind of store. This place where all the cars are parked right up in the corner near the entrance is a place called Dalplex. Some of you may know the Maritimes. This is Dalhousie University's gymnasium. It's the exercise center. It's where people go to exercise. And so these people have driven to the gym in order to exercise. But their unconscious mind will not let them park 1 centimeter further from the door. Okay? And this is telling you something very important about human nature. We can have a plan to be physically active and to exercise, and we can go to the gym and consciously push that. But our inner voice is telling us, go and lie down. Our inner voice is saying, try and minimize your physical activity. It's actually contrary to our brain program. You have to supersede your brain, your inner program, in order to overcome that, and that's a challenge. And so this is just illustrating that example. Okay, I'm going to stop there in terms of my talk because I want to get questions, and we'll direct the rest of the time that we have to address the specific questions that people have about weight problems and diabetes and how they're related.